The Harvest Festival had been going for 3 hours when Vivian Cross did what everyone in Dust Creek expected her to do. She made sure Mara Whitlock knew she didn't belong there. It wasn't loud. That was the cruelest part. Vivian didn't shout across the barn or make a scene that people could later claim they hadn't witnessed. She simply walked to the table where Mara had set down her covered dish. A potato and herb casserole she'd spent 2 evenings preparing, picked it up without a word, and moved it to the far end of the serving line, behind the sliced pies and the leftover bread rolls. She did it the way you'd move something that had been left in the wrong place by accident, tidying up. Then she turned back to her group of women and resumed her conversation, and not one of them missed a single word. Mara saw it happen. She was standing 12 feet away, close enough that there was no version of events where she could pretend otherwise. She stood there for a moment with her hands loose at her sides, and then she turned and walked to the far edge of the barn, near the open doors where the autumn air came in cold off the hills. Nobody followed her. Nobody had to. That was also part of it. If you'd been watching that night, really watching, not just glancing around the lantern-lit barn at the familiar faces of your neighbors, you might have noticed the man who did follow her with his eyes. Not immediately. He'd have been talking to the county land surveyor about water rights, a dull but necessary conversation, and he finished it before he moved. But he moved. His name was Colton Voss, and in Dust Creek, that name meant something. There are people you subscribe to without being asked, people whose next chapter you find yourself needing to know. If this story already has you asking what happens next, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels, like this video, so more people find it. And stay with me, because what happens between Mara Whitlock and Colton Voss is only just beginning. Mara had come to the Harvest Festival because her neighbor, old Pete Dillard, had told her she was starting to look like someone who'd forgotten other people existed. He'd said it kindly, the way Pete said most things, but the point landed. She'd spent 6 months since her father's last bad spell barely leaving the property except to get supplies from the general store. She was 27 years old, and she was already becoming a ghost. So she came. She washed her hair and put on the dress she'd bought 2 winters ago for her cousin's wedding, which still fit through the shoulders but pulled a little at the hips now. And she told herself it didn't matter. She carried her casserole dish the 1.25 miles to the Grange Hall because they didn't have a horse anymore. They'd sold it in April when the well repair bill came due. And she arrived with her arms aching and her boots damp from the creek crossing. The festival had been running smoothly for years before Mara started coming, and it would keep running smoothly regardless of whether she showed up or not. That was something she understood about herself in Dust Creek. She was not a presence that altered anything. She occupied space. She used up air. But she did not change the weather of a room the way some people did. Vivian Cross changed the weather of rooms. She was 32, the widow of a cattle broker who'd left her a house, a modest inheritance, and the kind of social position in a small town that functions almost like hereditary nobility. She was not a cruel woman in the dramatic sense. She didn't go out of her way to hurt people for sport. She simply had a very clear sense of order, of who belonged where in the valley's social landscape, and she maintained that order the way a gardener maintains a yard. Quietly, consistently, without much feeling about it. Mara Whitlock fell outside the boundary of that order. She always had. Her family had come to Dust Creek when Mara was 9, arriving with a wagon, a sick mother, and a father who had plans he never quite managed to execute. Her mother died 2 years after they arrived. Her father, Walter Whitlock, was not a bad man, but he was a man built for a different kind of life than the one the frontier kept handing him, and it wore him down in ways that became visible. He drank some, not terribly, but enough. He got behind on things. Mara learned early that if something was going to get done right, she was the one who was going to do it. By the time she was 16, she was keeping the farm's ledger. By 18, she was negotiating their seed credit with the supply merchant. By 22, her father's lungs had started failing him, and she took over the physical work as well. The fence repairs, the animal care, the twice-weekly trips to haul water when their well went dry in summer. She did all of it without calling it sacrifice, because calling it sacrifice would have required her to imagine what she was sacrificing it for, and she wasn't sure she could afford that imagination. She was not a woman people described as pretty. She knew this. She was broad through the frame, thick-waisted, with hands that showed work, and a face that was more honest than beautiful. People in Dust Creek had a talent for looking at a woman like Mara and seeing only the surface and finding the surface inadequate and stopping there. It took a particular kind of attention to look past the surface, and most people in most towns never bothered developing that attention because the surface was usually enough to tell you what you needed to know. Colton Voss was standing near the center of the barn when Vivian Cross moved Mara's dish. He noticed it the way he noticed most things, not with any particular expression, just a brief, complete registration of the event, filed away behind whatever else he was watching. He was 41 years old, which in Dust Creek meant he was old enough to have survived 3 serious droughts, 1 regional skirmish with a rival land association, a bad fever that had nearly taken him at 35, and the deaths of both his parents and one of his ranch hands. He had thick forearms and gray coming in at his temples, and he didn't talk much, which people in town sometimes mistook for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was just that he'd reached an age where he'd learned to tell the difference between words that mattered and words that were just noise, and he'd stopped producing the second kind. Every woman in the barn over the age of 22 knew Colton Voss was there. Most of them knew he'd been managing the Double V alone for 3 years since his first wife passed, and that the ranch was profitable and well-run, and that he was the kind of man who would not embarrass you. Several of them had made gentle overtures over those 3 years. Invitations to suppers, neighborly visits, small, deliberate gestures that he acknowledged politely and never followed up on. He watched Vivian Cross set Mara Whitlock's casserole at the end of the table behind the leftover bread. Then he watched Mara walk to the edge of the barn and stand in the cold air coming off the hills. He finished his conversation about water rights. Then he walked to where Mara was standing. She didn't see him coming. She was looking out at the dark field beyond the barn doors, and she was doing the thing she'd taught herself to do in moments like that one, going somewhere else in her mind. Working out a fence problem she'd been thinking about for 2 weeks, calculating how much hay they had left, and whether it would carry the 2 remaining goats through to March. Her mind was always running numbers, always solving, always 4 steps ahead of whatever she was feeling, because that was safer. "You bring that potato dish?" Colton said. She turned around fast, which she hated showing that she'd been caught off guard. "I did," she said. "It's good. I had some before they moved it." She looked at him. She was trying to work out whether he was being kind in the condescending way people were sometimes kind to her, the way you're kind to a stray animal, and she couldn't quite tell. He had a face that didn't announce its intentions. "The herb's wild rosemary," she said. "Grew it myself." "I know wild rosemary," he said. "Not many people use it in a potato dish." "Most people don't use what's available to them," she said. "They wait for what they think they're supposed to have." She didn't know why she said it. It was sharper than she'd intended. She waited for him to pull back the way people did when she said things like that, when she forgot to be soft enough. But he didn't pull back. "That's true," he said. "Most people do wait." They stood there for a moment with the noise of the festival behind them and the cold field ahead, and it was not exactly comfortable, but it was not unbearable either. There was something in it she couldn't name. "You're Mara Whitlock," he said, "Walter's daughter." "I am." "How's his lungs?" She almost said fine, because that was what you said when people asked after someone who wasn't fine. The word was forming. Then she stopped it. "Not improving," she said. He nodded. Not with pity, with the particular acknowledgement of someone who had sat with hard facts themselves and knew you didn't dress them up. "You've been running that farm alone." "I have." "How long?" 5 years for the heavy work," she said. "Longer for the decisions." He looked at her for a moment in a way that felt different from the way most people looked at her. He wasn't comparing her to something she wasn't. He was just looking at what was there. "I watched you at the town meeting in September," he said, "when Alderman Graves brought up the new tax schedule." Mara remembered the September meeting the way she remembered things that had cost her something. She'd sat in that room for 2 hours listening to Graves walk through his proposed tax assessment schedule, and she'd done the arithmetic in her head as he talked, and about 45 minutes in she'd understood what she was looking at. The schedule was structured in a way that appeared neutral, but wasn't. It grouped land parcels into categories based on declared productive acreage, and the cutoff lines were drawn precisely at the points that would push small acreage farms into higher tax brackets while leaving the large consolidated holdings, most of which were owned by Graves's 3 closest associates in the valley, in the lower tier. She'd said so. Quietly, at first, asking Graves to walk through the bracket definitions again, and then again when his explanation didn't match the numbers, and then a third time when she laid out the arithmetic on the chalkboard they kept at the front of the hall, showing exactly how much more a small farmer would pay under the schedule versus how much less a large holder would pay. There was a long silence after that. Graves had smiled the smile of someone who has been outmaneuvered in public and is deciding how to respond. The schedule was tabled. It had not come back up. That was just arithmetic, Mara said. It wasn't just arithmetic, Colton said. Plenty of people can do arithmetic. Not plenty of people do it when it means standing up in front of Graves with half the valley watching. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at her hands, her honest, worked hands, the hands that embarrassed her sometimes, that she'd learned to hold away from her sides so people wouldn't look at them too closely. You want to come back inside? He said. Your dish is getting eaten. I saw Hester Poole take a third portion. Despite everything, a small sound came out of her. Almost a laugh. Not quite. She does love potatoes, Mara said. Come on, he said, and it wasn't a command, just a direction, and she followed him back inside because somehow it seemed easier than staying where she was. What happened next inside the barn was not dramatic. Colton Voss stood near her. That was all. He didn't announce anything or make a gesture. He just positioned himself in her vicinity and talked to a few people who came by and included her in the conversation naturally and didn't treat her like a charity project he was managing. He talked to her the way he'd talk to anyone whose opinion he found worth having. The effect on the room was immediate and visible if you knew how to read it, which Mara did. She'd always known how to read a room. She just usually didn't like what she was reading. Vivian Cross glanced over 3 times in 7 minutes. The land surveyor she'd been speaking to earlier said something to Colton, and Colton introduced Mara by name without any qualifying explanation, and the surveyor shook her hand and asked about her farm's water situation, and Mara told him about the aquifer mapping she'd done on her own, using 2 books and a borrowed soil probe, and the surveyor raised his eyebrows in a way that was genuine. By 9 o'clock, 2 different people had come to Mara to ask about the aquifer mapping. She answered them carefully because she understood that interest could be withdrawn as fast as it was given, and she didn't let herself believe too much of it. But on the walk home, with the dark coming down hard, and her arms still aching from the casserole dish she carried back empty, Hester Poole had indeed been thorough. She let herself sit with the memory of the conversation at the barn door. The cold field. His face not performing anything. The way he'd said most people do wait, like she'd said something true that he'd been thinking himself. She made the creek crossing and felt the wet seep into her boot and kept walking. Her father was asleep when she got in, which was good. She sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and opened the farm ledger and looked at the numbers she'd been avoiding for a week. They were not good numbers. She knew what needed to happen. The north fence was going to fail before spring. They needed a new roof on the goat shelter. She'd been doing the math on selling the south pasture, the one her father had always planned to develop into something, and she knew it was probably time. She'd known it for 6 months. Knowing and doing were different things when the thing was the last plan your father had left. She closed the ledger. She sat in the quiet of the kitchen with the lamp burning low, and outside the wind had come up again and was moving through the dry grass on the hill, and she thought about what Colton Voss had said. Not the compliments, which she didn't quite trust yet. She thought about the thing that hadn't been said, the way he'd looked at what was there, not past it, not through it, at it. She'd spent 27 years in a world that looked through her. She wasn't sure what to do with someone who didn't. She put out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to her father breathe 3 rooms away. The slow, labored, determined breathing of a man who kept going out of sheer stubbornness. And she told herself not to build anything on a single conversation at a barn door. She was not always good at listening to herself. 3 days later, Colton Voss rode up her lane on a gray horse and knocked on the farmhouse door. Her father opened it before she could get there, which meant that by the time Mara came through from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, Walter Whitlock was already shaking Colton's hand with the careful, measured warmth of a man who is trying not to let his relief show too plainly. "My daughter tells me you grow wild rosemary," Walter said. Mara had not told him that. She'd said barely anything about the festival at all. "She grows it," Colton said. "I just eat it." His eyes found Mara over her father's shoulder, and there was something in them that might have been amusement or might have been something more careful. She kept the dish towel in her hands. It gave her something to hold. You came for a reason, she said, because she needed to know what it was before she could decide what to feel about it. I did, he said. I've been having a problem with my eastern waterline, and I think it might be similar to what you described at the festival. I could hire a surveyor. I thought maybe I'd ask you first. She looked at him. You're asking me for professional advice, she said flatly, making sure she understood. I'm asking you to look at a water problem, he said. I'll pay you. You don't need to pay me. I'll pay you, he said again, and his voice didn't shift, didn't negotiate, didn't soften it into charity. He meant it the way you mean a business arrangement, equal footing, her knowledge for his money. Something in her chest loosened by one small degree. Let me get my coat, she said. Walter Whitlock watched his daughter disappear back into the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway with the man who'd come to find her, and he said nothing for a moment. And then he said very quietly, She's been carrying more than she lets on. I know, Colton said. She doesn't like to be pitied. I'm not here to pity her, Colton said. Walter looked at him for a long moment with the careful eyes of a man who had made mistakes in his life and was still trying to account for them, and then he nodded once, slowly, and stood back from the door. Mara came back with her coat on and her notebook under her arm. She always carried a notebook, always, because observations you didn't write down were observations you lost. And she didn't ask her father if he'd be all right alone, because she knew he would be, and asking would only remind him that she worried. She walked out past him into the cold morning and fell into step beside Colton Voss, and the gray horse followed along like a patient dog, and behind them the farmhouse door closed softly, and Walter Whitlock went to his chair by the window and watched them go down the lane together until they turned and were gone from sight. He sat there a while after that with the morning light coming in weak and pale across the floor, and he breathed his slow, careful breaths, and he allowed himself, for the first time in a long time, to think that maybe things were not as finished as they'd looked. The eastern waterline was not what Colton had described it as. He'd said it was a problem. What Mara found when she crouched down in the frozen mud beside the main feed pipe was something closer to a slow catastrophe that had been unfolding for at least 2 seasons without anyone recognizing what they were looking at. The pipe itself was intact. That was the misleading part. You could look at it and see no obvious break, no rupture, nothing that announced itself as failure. But the ground around the pipe told a different story, and Mara had learned to read ground the way other people read faces. Hand me that probe, she said. Colton handed her the soil probe she'd pulled from her coat pocket, and she pushed it into the earth at 3-foot intervals along the line, checking resistance, checking moisture depth, building a picture in her head that she was also building in her notebook with a series of marks that would have meant nothing to most people, but meant something specific to her. You've got seepage, she said finally. Not a break. A seam separation, probably at the junction about 40 feet north of here. The water's been bleeding out underground. You've been losing pressure and thinking it was the source flow. Colton was quiet for a moment. I had 2 men look at this in August. What did they tell you? That the source flow was declining. The source flow is fine, Mara said. She stood up and brushed the mud off her knees without thinking about it, the automatic gesture of someone who spent most of their life dirty and had stopped apologizing for it. You've been losing 30 to 40% of your line volume to the ground, maybe more by now depending on how long the seam's been open. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise exactly, something more considered than surprise. That's a significant loss, he said. It is, she said. The good news is it's fixable. You'll need to expose the junction, which means digging, which means labor. But the pipe material's still good. You're not looking at a full replacement. She showed him the notebook, the marks and their meanings, the rough map she'd drawn of the waterline's course, and the estimated location of the separation. He looked at it carefully, following her pencil as she traced the explanation, and she noticed that he didn't pretend to understand faster than he did. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both about things she hadn't fully explained, and she answered them, and he nodded, and that was that. No performance of expertise he didn't have. No defensiveness about having missed something his own men had missed. Just information received and processed. It was, she thought, rarer than it should have been. They walked the rest of the line together, and she showed him 2 other areas of concern, not urgent, but worth watching. And he wrote them down in his own notebook, which surprised her. She hadn't taken him for a man who kept a notebook. Most ranchers your size don't bother with notes, she said. Not quite a question. Most ranchers my size have managers who keep notes for them, he said. I don't have a manager. Why not? He thought about it, which she appreciated. The pause that meant he was actually considering the question rather than reaching for the standard answer. I tried it for a year after Eleanor passed, he said. The man I hired was competent, but he made decisions based on what made sense to him, and this place doesn't always make sense to someone who doesn't know its history. He'd look at the south pasture and see underutilized grazing land. I'd look at it and know there's a frost pocket that kills cattle in a bad winter because it killed 4 of mine 15 years ago. That knowledge doesn't transfer. Mara thought about her own farm, about the things she knew about it that existed nowhere in any document. The particular way the creek ran in a wet spring, the spot near the north fence where the ground turned treacherous in a thaw, the goat that could open any latch that had more than 2 moving parts. All of it in her head and nowhere else. The accumulated knowledge of a place that you couldn't buy or hire. I understand that, she said. They were heading back toward the barn by then, and the morning had warmed marginally, enough that the breath vapor wasn't so thick. The gray horse was still following at Colton's shoulder with the patience of an old dog that had learned its person always came back eventually. You're good at this, he said. It wasn't flattering, it was observational, the way you'd comment on a well-built fence post. I've had to be, she said. There's a difference between having to be and actually being. She didn't answer that. They walked in silence for a bit, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which still surprised her. She was not usually comfortable in silence with other people. Silence with other people had a way of becoming a space where she became aware of all the ways she didn't fit. At the barn door, he stopped and turned to face her, and she had the sense of something shifting, some gear engaging that hadn't been engaged before. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to hear it plainly, not the way you're probably expecting it. She waited. I've been thinking about finding someone to share the ranch with, he said. Not a manager, a partner. Someone who'd have an equal say in decisions and an equal stake in outcomes. He paused. I'm not a man who circles around things, so I'll say it directly. I think you might be that person. I'd like to continue spending time with you to find out if that's true. The field was very quiet. Somewhere behind the barn, one of the horses knocked against a stall door. You're talking about courtship, Mara said carefully. I'm talking about figuring out if we'd work, he said. Courtship is a word that has a lot of ceremony attached to it. I'm talking about something more practical than ceremony. She looked at him for a long moment. She was doing the calculation she always did, the one that ran underneath every other thought she had, the one that asked what the actual cost of this was, what the risk looked like, what happened if the thing went wrong. She'd been doing that calculation her whole life, and it had mostly kept her safe, and safe had also mostly meant alone. My father is ill, she said. I know. I can't leave the farm. Nobody's asking you to leave anything, he said. Not yet. I'm asking if we can spend time together. That's all I'm asking right now. She looked down at her notebook, still in her hands. The map of his waterline, the marks, the careful notation of things that mattered. All right, she said. It was not a romantic yes. It was not a breathless yes. It was the yes of a woman who had learned to be careful about what she let herself want, agreeing to be a little less careful than usual. Colton nodded, once, the same way her father had nodded at him that morning. Something settled and acknowledged. I'll have someone begin the dig on the junction by Thursday, he said, and handed her the folded bills he'd taken from his vest pocket, and she took them without argument because he'd been right. It was a business arrangement, and pretending otherwise would have made it something smaller. She walked home with mud on her knees and the money in her coat pocket and her notebook under her arm, and she didn't let herself think too much about what she'd agreed to. She thought instead about the frost pocket in the south pasture, and the goat that could open complicated latches, and the way some knowledge just lived in a person and couldn't be transferred. The town found out about it the way Dust Creek found out about everything, incrementally, imprecisely, and with a great deal of embellishment. The first version, which circulated within a week, was that Colton Voss had hired Mara Whitlock to do some kind of assessment work on his property. This version was largely accurate and generated mild interest. The second version, which arrived 3 days after the first, was that he'd been seen with her twice, which was technically true if you counted the festival and the farm visit, and this version generated considerably more interest. By the time the third version was in circulation, that Colton Voss was actively courting Mara Whitlock, the interest had sharpened into something with an edge to it. Vivian Cross heard the third version from her friend Agnes Morrow, who heard it from the wife of the man who sold feed to the Double V. She received it in her front parlor on a Thursday afternoon, over tea, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "That doesn't make any sense." "That's what I said," Agnes told her. "Colton Voss is one of the most eligible men in this county," Vivian said. She said it matter-of-factly, not with longing. She was too controlled for longing, but with the straightforward assessment of someone cataloging an obvious fact. "He could have his pick. Why would he—" She stopped herself. Agnes knew why she'd stopped. The sentence had nowhere good to go. "Maybe he doesn't know her circumstances," Agnes offered. "He knows her circumstances," Vivian said. "He knows everyone's circumstances." She set her teacup down carefully. "He's always known what he's doing. That's what makes this strange." What Vivian could not articulate, because she didn't fully understand it herself, was that her objection wasn't about Mara Whitlock's poverty, or her weight, or her unremarkable face. Those things were real, in the sense that the social arithmetic of Dust Creek was real, but they weren't quite what was bothering her. What was bothering her was something harder to name, the possibility that she'd been wrong, that the way she'd understood the world, the way she'd always organized it, sorted it, maintained it, had a flaw in it she hadn't seen, that Colton Voss, whose judgment she'd always respected even from a distance, had looked at Mara Whitlock and seen something she'd looked at and missed. She didn't say any of this to Agnes. She picked her teacup back up and changed the subject, and she was perfectly pleasant for the remainder of the visit. And after Agnes left, she sat in her front parlor alone for a while and thought about the September town meeting, which she'd attended and had somehow filed away as Mara being disruptive, rather than Mara being right. She didn't like what that said about her filing system. The time Colton and Mara spent together in the weeks that followed was not picturesque. There were no moonlit rides or candlelit evenings. There were 2 more visits to the Double V for water-related questions, one of which turned into a 3-hour conversation about Colton's Eastern pasture rotation schedule that Mara ended up improving on paper while they sat at his kitchen table, both of them eating cold biscuits because neither of them had thought about the time. There was one Sunday afternoon where he came to the Whitlock farm and helped Mara repair the north fence, which she'd been dreading because it required setting new posts, and she couldn't do that alone with her father unable to help. He brought 2 of his hands with him, and the 4 of them worked through the afternoon and had the line rebuilt by dark. And when she tried to pay him for the labor, he told her to apply it against the water assessment, which was more than it was worth, but she didn't argue. What she was learning about him was accumulating in layers, the way knowledge of a piece of land accumulated. He was not patient by nature. She could see that in the way he moved through his days, always slightly ahead of the current moment, already thinking about what came next. But he'd trained himself into patience the way you train a muscle, with repetition and some pain. He had opinions about most things and shared them directly when asked, but he didn't push them on people who hadn't asked, which was rarer than it seemed. He did not complain about things he couldn't change, and he didn't pretend problems didn't exist. And he woke before dawn every day because that was when the thinking was clearest, which she understood completely because she did the same thing for the same reason. I was not a man who said much about feeling, but she was learning to read the things he did instead of saying them, the way you learn to read weather, by watching what accumulates rather than waiting for someone to announce it. Her father liked him. Walter Whitlock had a finely tuned instrument for detecting men who thought they were more important than they were, and it had been calibrated by a lifetime of being looked past, and it said nothing alarming about Colton Voss. He talked to Walter as though Walter were a man whose thoughts still mattered, which they did, even if his lungs didn't cooperate. He asked about the farm's history, about the decisions Walter had made in the early years, and he listened to the answers with what appeared to be genuine interest, and Mara watched this and felt something complicated in her chest that she didn't try to name. She was not falling in love. She told herself this firmly. She was being careful. She was assessing, the way she assessed everything, the water line, the fence, the ledger numbers. She was building information before drawing conclusions. This was what she told herself, and it was mostly true. The town meeting in November was called to address what Alderman Graves was now calling a land assessment review, which was a different name for essentially the same structure he'd tried to push through in September. He'd been more careful this time. The bracket cutoffs were adjusted by small amounts, and a sunset clause had been added that made it look like a temporary measure. He'd also spent 6 weeks before the meeting visiting the larger property holders and explaining, quietly, why the schedule benefited the valley as a whole and would create stability for established operations. Mara had heard about the meeting the day before through Pete Dillard, who'd heard about it from his brother-in-law, who worked at the Grange Hall and had seen the posted notice. She'd spent the evening at the kitchen table with a copy of the original September proposal, which she'd kept, and the scant details she'd been able to gather about the new version, and she worked through it the way she worked through everything, slowly, methodically, following the numbers wherever they led. They led to the same place. The mechanism was different. The cutoffs had moved, but the effect was the same. The smallest farms, the ones operating on the thinnest margins, would pay proportionally more. The largest holdings would pay proportionally less. The sunset clause was written with a renewal provision that would make it permanent within 3 years if no objection was formally registered during a specific 90-day window that happened to coincide with spring planting, when every farmer with a small operation was too occupied to attend meetings. She sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote out the arithmetic and went to bed. The meeting was at 7 in the evening, in the same hall where the September meeting had been. It was colder this time, and people crowded in wearing their heavy coats and stamping snow off their boots. There were maybe 60 people in the room, which was a good turnout for a November evening, but Mara recognized that a lot of them were the kind of attendees who came to meetings to have been present rather than to participate. They'd agree with whatever seemed to have momentum. Graves opened with a presentation that had clearly been prepared with care. Charts. A written summary distributed on paper, which was an expense, which told you something about how much he wanted this to succeed. He was smooth without being slick. He'd learned from September, and the September version of his performance had been more aggressive. This one was temperate, reasonable, a man proposing a sensible administrative adjustment. He finished and asked for questions, and 3 people asked questions, and he answered them capably, and Mara could feel the momentum of the room tilting. Not enthusiastically. The room wasn't enthusiastic, but tilting toward the path of least resistance, which was agreement. She raised her hand. Graves saw her, and there was a half-second of something in his face before the smooth expression reassembled. Miss Whitlock, he said. I have a few arithmetic questions, she said. The room shifted. People who'd been settling turned back toward the front. She asked the questions quietly. She didn't accuse. She just asked him to explain the bracket definitions again, and then to explain the renewal provision language, and then to confirm the 90-day objection window fell during spring planting. And with each question, she could see him calculating whether to answer directly or redirect, and she could see him deciding that redirecting would look worse, and she could see the arithmetic of the room changing as he answered. When she laid out the final numbers, what a small farmer would pay over a 3-year period versus what a large holder would pay under both the temporary measure and the automatic renewal, she didn't frame it as an accusation, she just read the numbers aloud. The room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Pete Dillard said, from the back, "Those numbers right, Mara?" "They are," she said. Someone else, she didn't see who, said, "That can't be right." "Anyone who wants to check the arithmetic is welcome to the paper," she said. "I'll leave it at the front." Graves did not lose his composure entirely, but he lost enough of it that the room could see the seams. He said the analysis was incomplete, that it failed to account for infrastructure offsets that would benefit all property holders. And he used some language that sounded specific but wasn't. And when Mara asked him to quantify the infrastructure offsets, he said that would require a separate analysis to be commissioned. The schedule was tabled again. This time, the silence after the meeting had a different texture than the September silence. In September, people had been surprised. Now there was something else. The particular discomfort of people who were realizing they'd almost let something happen to them twice, and that both times the same woman had stopped it. Colton found her afterward, near the door, pulling on her coat. "You had that prepared," he said. "I had it prepared," she confirmed. "How'd you know he was going to bring it back?" "Because he didn't get what he wanted the first time," she said. "And men like that don't stop after one failure. They adjust and try again. I'd have been surprised if he'd waited even this long." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in that way he had. "You're not surprised by anything, are you?" "I'm surprised by some things," she said. She finished buttoning her coat. I was surprised when you came to my door. Outside, they walked separately toward their horses. She'd borrowed old Pete's mare for the evening, and the cold was complete and hard-edged, and the stars were very clear. She could hear people leaving the hall behind them, the burst of conversation as the doors opened, and then the cold swallowing it. Mara, he said, when they reached the hitching post. She turned. I'd like to ask you to marry me, he said. Not tonight. I'm not asking tonight. But I want you to know that's where I'm headed, so you can decide how you feel about that while there's still time to tell me to go to hell. She stood there with the reins of Pete's borrowed mare in her hands, and the cold coming in around the edges of her coat. And she looked at him, and she thought about the north fence repaired, and the water line mapped, and the kitchen table with the cold biscuits, and her father's face when Colton came through the door. That's a strange way to not propose to someone, she said. I'm a practical man, he said. I've noticed, she said. She swung up onto the mare and turned her toward the road, and she could feel him watching her go, and she let herself feel it, the watching and what it meant, and how different it was from being invisible. She rode the 2 miles home in the dark and the cold, and when she got in, her father was still awake, sitting by the window with a lamp. And he looked at her face when she came through the door, and he said very simply, "Good meeting?" "Productive," she said. He smiled, the careful smile of a man who is conserving energy but not feeling, because he had plenty of feeling left, even if the lungs were failing. "Sit with me a minute," he said. She sat, still in her coat, and they were quiet together for a while, the way people are quiet together when they've known each other long enough that the silence doesn't need to be managed. "He's a good man," her father said. He wasn't asking. "I think so," she said. "You're allowed to want things," Walter said. He said it quietly, not as a lecture, just as a fact he was putting into the room because he thought it needed to be there. "You've spent a long time not letting yourself want things. I'm not unaware of why." She didn't answer right away. Outside the wind was back up, moving through the dry grass, and the lamp made a small island of warmth in the cold kitchen. "I know," she said at last. Walter nodded and closed his eyes, not sleeping, just resting them. His breathing was labored and slow, the way it always was by this hour. She sat with him until his breathing steadied, and she thought he might be drifting, and then she got up carefully and banked the fire and put out all but one lamp and went to her room. She lay in the dark, and she did not do the calculation this time. She put the calculation down and just let herself sit with the question of what it might mean to build something with someone. Not to be saved, not to be managed, to build. It felt unfamiliar. She stayed with the unfamiliarity until it became something closer to possibility, and then she slept. The proposal, when it actually came, was nothing like she'd expected, which meant it was exactly right. It was 2 weeks after the November meeting, on a Wednesday, which was not a day with any particular significance. He'd come by the farm in the morning on the waterline pretext. There was still a legitimate pretext, since the dig had revealed a second seam issue 40 feet from the first, and they'd worked through it together and walked the repaired section, and she'd confirmed the fix was solid. They were standing at the fence line where his property met the old Dillard acreage, with the morning sun coming flat across the frozen ground and making everything look like it had edges, and he said, "I think you should marry me." Not a question, not quite a statement, something in between. "That's not a proposal," she said. "That's a position." "It is," he agreed. "What's yours?" She looked at the frozen ground. She thought about the south pasture she needed to sell, and the roof on the goat shelter, and her father's breathing, and also, because she was trying to be a person who let herself want things, about cold biscuits on a kitchen table, and a fence rebuilt before dark, and a man who kept notes in his own notebook because some knowledge didn't transfer. "Yes," she said, "but I need to bring my father to the Double V. I won't leave him alone." "I already thought of that," Colton said. "The east bedroom has a southern exposure, warmer in winter, better for lungs." She looked at him. "You already thought of that," she said. "I told you," he said. "I'm a practical man." Something in her that had been held at a careful distance moved closer, and she let it. It was not a flood or a rush or any of the breathless things she'd been quietly skeptical of her whole life. It was slower than that, steadier. The way water moves underground, finding its level, filling the spaces that have been waiting. "When?" she said. "Soon," he said. "Before the hard winter. I'd rather not move your father in a blizzard." "No," she said. "Neither would I." They stood at the fence line for another moment, and then they turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, and the gray horse followed along as it always did, patient and certain, and the frozen ground was solid underfoot, and that was how it was decided. Not with ceremony. With the quiet, complete settling of two people who had looked at each other plainly and found something real enough to build on. The town of Dust Creek heard about the engagement 2 days later, in the inevitable way that towns hear things, and the reaction was everything Mara had expected, and none of it surprised her. She had already learned, or was still learning, that other people's expectations were not the same thing as facts. The women who believed Colton had made a ruinous mistake were working from a story that didn't include the waterline or the fence or the November meeting or cold biscuits on a table or the east bedroom with its southern exposure. They were working from the story they'd written for him, the one where he chose among the beautiful and the well-connected and kept the world in its expected order. He hadn't read that story, or he'd read it and put it down. Vivian Cross, when she heard, sat very still in her parlor for a long moment. Then she said to no one in particular, "He knows something I don't." She wasn't wrong, but it would take her a while longer to figure out what it was. And Mara Whitlock, who had spent 27 years learning to survive without expecting much from the world, was sitting at the kitchen table when she heard her father's slow steps coming from his room, and she looked up, and he was already smiling, and she thought, "All right then. All right." They were married on a Friday in December, 3 weeks after Colton said, "I think you should marry me at the fence line," in a ceremony that lasted 20 minutes and was attended by Pete Dillard, his wife Ruth, Walter Whitlock in a chair they'd carried in from the parlor, and a justice of the peace named Harold Birch, who had a cold and kept sniffling through the vows. It was not a beautiful wedding. The flowers Mara had cut from the last of the autumn growth in the garden were half dead by the time she arranged them, and the dress she wore was the same dress from her cousin's wedding 2 years before, the one that pulled at the hips, and she'd let it pull because there wasn't time or money for anything else. Colton wore a clean shirt and his better vest, and he looked like a man who had made a decision he was not second-guessing, which was the most reassuring thing she could have asked for. Harold Birch sneezed twice during the exchange of rings. "Bless you," Walter said from his chair, with the mild courtesy of a man who had decided the ceremony was going well enough. Mara almost laughed. She held it in, barely, and when she glanced at Colton, she could see the corner of his mouth doing something controlled, and that was the moment, she would think later. Not the vows, not the ring, but the shared effort of not laughing at a sneezing justice of the peace, that she understood she had married the right person. They moved Walter into the east bedroom at the Double V the following weekend. It had a southern exposure, as Colton had noted, and it was warmer than the room he'd occupied at the farm. Walter sat in his new chair by the new window and looked out at the frozen pasture and said, "The light's different here." And Mara said, "Is that good?" And he said, "Ask me in the spring," which was the most optimistic thing he'd said about the future in 2 years. The Double V was a working ranch, and what that meant in practice was that Mara's days began before the light and ended after it, and everything in between was a sequence of problems to be addressed in order of urgency. She had known this going in. She had not fully known what it would mean to address those problems in a place where she was new, in front of people who had their own established opinions about what she was and what she wasn't. Colton employed 7 men, 6 full-time ranch hands, and a part-time cook named Bess who came 3 days a week and was deeply suspicious of anyone who rearranged the kitchen. The ranch hands were polite to Mara in the careful way of people who are withholding judgment and trying not to make it obvious. The oldest among them, a lean, weathered man named Dutch Haverford, who had worked the Double 5 for 11 years, was the least concealed about his skepticism. He didn't say anything directly. Dutch was too experienced for that. But he had a way of answering Mara's questions that involved a fractional pause before the response, the pause of a man deciding whether the question was worth answering fully. She noticed this. She filed it and kept moving. The ranch's financial records were in better shape than she'd feared and not as good as she'd hoped. Colton was not careless with money, but he had the approach of a man who understood operations deeply and paperwork at the level of necessity, which meant he knew what everything cost but had not always tracked where the inefficiencies were accumulating. She found them in 3 places in the first 2 weeks: the feed purchasing schedule, which was buying in quantities that made sense for peak season but were being maintained through the shoulder months when they could have dropped the order volume and saved a meaningful amount over a year. The equipment repair contracts, which were going to a single supplier at rates that hadn't been renegotiated in 7 years. And the winter grazing rotation, which was costing them more in hay than it should have because the sequence of pasture use wasn't accounting for shelter availability. She brought all three to Colton on a Sunday evening, written up in the same format she'd used for her own farm ledger: clear, plain, no elaboration beyond what the numbers required. He looked through it for a while without speaking. Then he said, "The feed schedule I should have caught." "It's easy to miss when operations are running smoothly," she said. "You're solving different problems." "Don't be generous about it," he said, not unkindly. "I missed it." "What's the number?" She told him. He nodded, not with pleasure, but with the acceptance of a man who preferred knowing to not knowing even when what he was learning was unflattering. "The equipment contracts," he said. "Warren Stills is not going to like being renegotiated." "Warren Stills has been charging you 12% above regional rate for 7 years, Mara said. "He's had a long time to not like it privately." Colton looked at her with the expression she'd begun to recognize. Not quite amusement, not quite admiration, something that partook of both without fully committing to either. "You want to do the negotiation?" he said. "I think I should," she said. "You've known Warren a long time. That makes it harder to be direct. And you don't have that problem." "I've never met the man," she said. "I have no problem at all." He agreed. She met with Warren Stills the following Tuesday in the supply merchant's back office, and the negotiation took 40 minutes, and it was not pleasant, and she came out of it with a contract at 4% below the previous rate, which was not as much as she'd wanted but was considerably better than what they'd been paying, and Warren Stills shook her hand at the end with the expression of a man who had been outmaneuvered in his own office and was trying to decide how to feel about respecting someone he'd expected to dismiss. She reported the result to Colton that evening, and he said, 4%, and she said, "I wanted 6. And he said, "You got 4 more than I would have gotten." And she said, "You would have gotten 0. You've known him too long." And he said, "Yes." And that was their first real negotiation as partners, and it was fine. What was not fine was the ranch hands. Not all of them. 2 of the younger men, Billy Crane and a quiet Texan named Sal Morales, had adapted to Mara's presence with the pragmatism of people who cared about results more than precedent. Billy, because he was 22 and hadn't yet developed the rigid categories of older men. Sal, because he'd grown up watching his mother run a small ranch in the hill country after his father died, and he had no illusions about what women could and couldn't do. But the others were slower, and Dutch Haverford was the slowest. The thing that broke it open, when it broke, was not confrontational in any dramatic way. It was a fence issue, not her north fence, but the southeastern pasture fence on the Double V's property, a stretch of line that Dutch had been meaning to check since October and had not gotten to. Mara found it on a walk she took every morning to familiarize herself with the land's edges and its habits, the same walk she'd done on her own property for years. She found 3 sections of compromised post in a 100-yard stretch, one of them already tilting enough that a determined cow could have pushed through. She brought it to Dutch directly because he was responsible for the fence crew, and it was his work to address. Dutch listened to her report with the fractional pause, and then he said, "I'll get to it." "The middle section won't wait," she said. "The post's loose enough that we're a bad morning away from cattle in the South Creek." "I know my fences, ma'am," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She'd been expecting this conversation in one form or another since she'd arrived, and she'd been preparing for it by watching Dutch and understanding what he actually responded to, which was not authority asserted but competence demonstrated. "I know you do," she said. "You know something wrong with that section too, or you'd have gotten to it before now. What is it?" The pause was longer this time. He looked at her with the recalibrating expression of someone who'd expected to end a conversation and found it still going. "Ground's soft there," he said finally. "We set a new post. It'll heave with the frost. Done it twice already." "There's a way to set it so it doesn't heave," she said. "Pack the base with gravel below the frost line. It's more labor, but the post holds." "Where'd you learn that?" "My farm," she said. "We have the same problem on the north line. I set 2 posts that way 4 years ago. They're still solid." Dutch looked at her for what she recognized as a genuine evaluating moment. Not dismissive, not the managed politeness of before, but actual looking. How deep are you taking the base? 18 inches of gravel, at least. Depends on your frost line here. 20, he said. We go down pretty hard. Then 22 on the gravel, she said. Slower, but it holds. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll get Sal and Billy on it this afternoon. Thank you, she said, and walked away. And she did not look back because looking back would have been checking to see if it had worked. And she was trying to be a person who did the thing and trusted the thing and didn't require immediate confirmation. It worked. He did. And the following Monday, Dutch stopped at the kitchen door on his way past and said, Post solid, with the particular neutrality of a man reporting a result that he had complicated feelings about. And Mara said, Good. And that was the whole conversation, and things were different after that. Not easy, not warm, but different in the way that mattered. Walter Whitlock had a bad week in January. His lungs, which had been operating at a reduced but stable capacity, made a sudden decline sometime around the 8th of the month that showed up first as more labored breathing at night, and then as an inability to get through a short walk across the room without stopping. The doctor came out from town, a capable, tired man named Hartley who'd been practicing in Dust Creek for 16 years, and listened to Walter's chest and adjusted his medication and said what he always said, which was that rest and warmth were the only reliable interventions, and they were providing both. Mara sat with her father in the evenings after that week began. Not all evening. She had work through the day and into the early dark. But the last hour before he slept, she'd pull her chair to his bedside and they'd talk or they wouldn't, depending on what he had energy for. He liked to hear about the ranch, what she was working on, what she'd found or fixed or figured out. She told him about the fence posts and the gravel packing technique, and he nodded with the satisfaction of a man who had passed something on without intending to, and she thought about all the small knowledge that lived in her that had come from watching him, before the lungs, before the declining years, watching him work, watching him figure things out, watching him make mistakes and try again without making much of it. You're good here, he said one evening, not as a question. I'm learning it, she said. That's not what I mean, he said. I mean, you're good here. This is where you should be. She didn't know how to answer that. She put her hand over his, the worked and thinning hand of a man who'd spent 60 years at physical labor and was finally being asked to stop. Don't get sentimental on me, she said. I'm dying, he said mildly. I'm allowed a little sentiment. You're not dying any faster than last month, she said. Mara. Walter. He smiled, the careful, energy-conserving smile. You're so much like your mother, he said. She couldn't take a compliment either. She sat with that for a moment. Her mother had been dead for 18 years, and she carried her the way you carry someone who left when you were still being formed. Incompletely, in pieces, more feeling than image. That's not a bad thing, she said. No, her father said. It wasn't. The storm came in the second week of February. It had been building for 3 days, visible to anyone who watched the sky the way ranchers watched it. The particular quality of the clouds stacking in from the northwest, the pressure in the air, the way the horses were restless and eating too much. Mara had been watching it since Monday, and she'd said to Colton on Tuesday morning that they should move the cattle in the north pasture to the lower grazing area while they still could, and he'd said he was planning to, and on Wednesday morning he had Dutch and the 3 senior hands ride out to do the move, while Mara stayed at the ranch headquarters, managing what needed to be managed from there. The storm arrived on Wednesday afternoon, not gradually, but all at once, the way the worst ones always came. 1 hour of warning sky, and then a wall of white that cut visibility to 20 feet and dropped the temperature 15 degrees in 30 minutes, and turned the ordinary landscape into something alien and dangerous. Mara was in the barn when it hit, checking that the horses were secured, and the sound of it reaching her was like being inside something enormous that had decided to close. She went through the barn's interior connections to the equipment shed, and from there to the main house, moving through the network of covered walkways Colton had built specifically for winters like this one. The walkways were one of the smartest pieces of construction she'd encountered on the Double V, and she'd told him so the first time she noticed them. He'd built them the winter after his wife Eleanor died, when he'd been doing the work alone, and she'd always understood that without asking. Inside the house, Bess had the kitchen fire going, and was making something that smelled like it involved a lot of salt pork. Walter was in his chair by the window in the east bedroom, watching the white outside with the calm attention of a man who had seen many winters. Colton was not home. He'd ridden out with Dutch and the others that morning and had not returned. That was expected. The move was a day's work, and they'd likely have waited out the first hours of the storm at the Northline shack rather than ride through the worst of it. But by 4 in the afternoon, the storm was not moderating, and there was still no sign of them, and the shack was a mile and a half past the cattle, and Mara began doing what she always did with numbers she didn't like. She recalculated them several times, hoping the answer would change, and it didn't. She found Billy Crane and Sal Morales in the bunkhouse, the two men who'd stayed back to manage headquarters. "What do you know about the old mining tunnels on the north property?" she said. Billy looked up. "Old Hendricks tunnels? They've been closed off 10 years. Are they passable?" "Some of them," Sal said. He'd sat up straight, reading her face. "You thinking about the north shack?" "I'm thinking there's a mile and a half of open ground between here and there," she said, "and a storm that's not going to break before morning." "You can't ride in this," Billy said. "I know," she said. "What about the tunnels? Do they run north?" There was a pause while both men recalibrated what they understood about the conversation they were in. Sal said, "Part of the main shaft goes north maybe 800 yards, but there's a section that caved." "How bad is the cave?" "Partial. Maybe 4 feet of debris." "Can it be cleared?" Another pause. "In maybe 2 hours," Sal said slowly. "If we had the right tools." "What tools?" "Picks. Short-handled. Timber bracing in case the section's unstable." "Where are they?" Sal got up from his bunk. "Equipment shed," he said. "I'll show you." Billy was already on his feet before Sal finished the sentence, and Mara thought, in a detached way, that this was what trust looked like when it was practical rather than sentimental. Two men who would follow a plan into a dark tunnel in a blizzard because the plan made sense, not because they were commanded. She found the tunnel entrance in the northeast corner of the root cellar, behind stacked crates, a low wooden door with an iron latch that had been latched for years and was stiff with disuse. Sal went first with the lamp, and she and Billy followed with the tools. The tunnel was stone-walled and earth-floored and smelled of deep cold and old darkness, but the ceiling held, and the main shaft was wider than she'd expected, wide enough to walk upright for the first several hundred yards. The collapsed section was worse than 4 feet of debris. It was closer to 8, and a section of ceiling had come down with it, which meant the timber bracing was not optional. Billy worked the bracing while Sal and Mara cleared debris, and the work was slow and physical, and she did her share of it without discussing it. Her hands were bleeding through the gloves by the time the first passage opened. A narrow space, a body's width, but a passage. They cleared it to something manageable in an hour 40, which was better than Sal's estimate. Mara went through first because she was the smallest, and came out the other side into a continuing tunnel that was intact and ran north at a slight incline, and she held her lamp up and followed it until the air changed and she found the secondary access, a hinged grate, frozen shut, that took her shoulder and both hands and considerable language she didn't usually use to push open. She came up into the snow 40 yards from the Northline shack. The storm was full dark by then, and she could feel it trying to take her, the wind pulling at her coat, the cold that wasn't cold in the ordinary sense, but something with an opinion about whether she belonged out in it. She put her head down and moved toward the faint orange line of lamplight at the shack's window, and she got through the door and fell against the inside wall, and the warmth hit her all at once like something solid. 5 faces turned to look at her. Dutch Haverford. 2 ranch hands she knew less well, Garrett and Tomas. A young man she didn't recognize, probably from a neighboring outfit who'd been caught in the storm. And Colton, who was sitting against the far wall with a piece of cloth wrapped around his left forearm and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not fear, not quite, but the calibrated alertness of someone who has been managing a bad situation for several hours and is tired from the management of it. "Mara," he said. "There's a tunnel," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Opens into the root cellar. Sal and Billy cleared a collapsed section. It'll hold if we go in groups of 2 and stay close to the right wall where the bracing is." Nobody spoke for a moment. "You cleared a collapsed tunnel section," Colton said. "Sal knew the tunnels," she said. "I knew we needed a way through." She looked at his arm. "What happened?" "Wire," he said. We were getting the last of the cattle through when a section of fence came down. It's not bad. She crossed the room and looked at it. Not bad was debatable. It had gone deep, but the bleeding had slowed and he'd wrapped it reasonably well. You need Hartley to look at that, she said. I need to get everyone out of this shack first, he said. Then let's go, she said. They came through the tunnel in pairs. Dutch and Garrett first, then Tomas and the young man from the neighboring outfit, whose name was Cal, and who was 19 and trying very hard not to show that the tunnel terrified him. Colton and Mara came through last, Colton slightly behind her, and she could hear him breathing in the dark, and it steadied her in a way she didn't examine. When they came up through the root cellar into the house, Bess was at the kitchen table with a pot of something hot and a lamp turned up full, and she looked at the group of them filing in, muddy, cold, the young man Cal pale and shaking, Colton with his wrapped arm. And she said nothing at all, just started ladling, because Bess's relationship with crisis was entirely practical, and she had already decided that hot food was the correct response and did not require discussion. Walter appeared in the doorway of the east bedroom in his dressing gown, taking in the scene. The cattle? He said. Lower pasture, Mara said. They're in. Good, Walter said, and went back to bed, because he had spent 60 years on a farm, and he understood that if the cattle were in and people were in and hot food was happening, then the crisis had resolved itself into recovery, and recovery didn't require his involvement. The storm ran through the night and into the following morning and stopped sometime around 10 with the particular abrupt cessation that meant it had exhausted itself rather than merely paused. The world outside was white and absolute, the fences gone under drifts, the familiar landscape made strange and flat. Mara had slept 4 hours on the kitchen settle, her coat still on, and woke to find Sal already outside assessing the damage, and Bess at the stove and Colton at the kitchen table with his arm rewrapped and a cup of something in his good hand, looking at the winter morning through the window with an expression she couldn't read from the doorway. She came in and sat down across from him, and Bess put a cup in front of her without being asked. The cattle take any losses? She said. Sal's counting now, he said. I don't think so. We got them all in. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Her hands were sore. The gloves had helped, but the debris clearing had taken its toll, and the warmth from the cup was something close to necessary. The tunnel needs to be properly cleared and maintained, she said. If we're going to use it as an emergency route, it needs timber bracing along the whole north section and a proper door on the far end, instead of that grate. Yes, he said. I'd like to draw up what that work looks like. Materials, labor. Yes, he said again. He was looking at her with the particular steady attention that she'd learned by now was his version of something other men would have said aloud. Mara. What? You came through a collapsed tunnel in a blizzard. The section we cleared held fine, she said. That's not... He stopped. He looked at his cup for a moment, and she waited, because she'd learned that his pauses were doing something. Thank you, he said. It was not a large thing the way he said it. It was not dramatic, but she heard in it what he meant, which was more than gratitude for the rescue. It was the acknowledgement of something he'd understood but not said, which was that she had walked into a dark tunnel in a blizzard, not because someone told her to, and not because she was trying to prove anything, but because that was what needed to happen, and she was the one who could see it. You'd have done the same, she said. I'd have tried, he said. I don't know if I'd have seen the tunnels. She drank her coffee. Outside Sal's voice was audible through the walls, calling out to Billy about drifts near the east fence. 2 things, she said. Hartley needs to see that arm today, not tomorrow, and we need to get a proper count on the cattle before the snow refreezes over the lower pasture. One of those is about the cattle, he said. Both of them are, she said. You're not useful with an infected arm. There was a pause, and then the corner of his mouth did the thing it did, the almost expression, and he said, That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. She looked at him steadily. I'll try to do better. Don't, he said. I meant it. She looked away, out at the window at the white world, and she allowed herself one moment of feeling what she felt, which was something that had been building since a barn door in October and a cold field and a man who looked at what was there instead of past it, and it was not small. Then she put the cup down and stood up and went to find her coat because the cattle needed counting, and the day was not going to manage itself. And she was who she was, a woman who moved through the world by doing the next necessary thing, and she did not think that was going to change. She was not sure she wanted it to. The cattle count came in at full numbers. Not a single animal lost, which Dutch Haverford reported to Mara on the morning after the storm with the particular flatness of a man delivering information he has strong feelings about and has decided not to express. She thanked him and wrote it in her notebook and went back to the feed schedule she'd been revising, and Dutch stood in the doorway of the tack room for a moment longer than necessary before he left, which she noted and filed away. Colton saw Hartley that afternoon. The wound on his forearm was deeper than the cloth wrapping had suggested. The wire had gone in at an angle and caught muscle, and Hartley cleaned it and stitched it with the particular silence of a doctor who is not going to tell you what he's thinking until he's done with the work. When he was finished, he said the arm needed 2 weeks of light use, which Colton heard and did not argue with, which told Mara more about how much it hurt than any amount of description would have. She took over his morning rounds. She did not announce this. She simply began doing them, starting before dawn the way she always started, walking the near pastures and the barn and the equipment shed and noting what needed noting. Dutch fell into step with her on the third morning without comment, and she accepted his presence without comment, and they walked the east fence line together in the gray pre-dawn. And he told her where the weak sections were, and she wrote them down, and somewhere in the course of that walk the fractional pause before his answers disappeared and did not come back. It didn't happen dramatically. It didn't announce itself. It was more like a shift in weather. You couldn't point to the exact moment it changed, only to the fact that at one point the air was one thing, and now it was another. The story of the blizzard moved through Dust Creek the way stories moved through small places, unevenly, with embellishment, arriving at different people at different times and in different forms. What remained consistent across versions was the central fact. Mara Voss had cleared a collapsed tunnel section and walked through it in a February blizzard to bring 5 men out of a line shack. Everything else got adjusted in the telling, but that part stayed. Pete Dillard heard it first, from Billy Crane, who had been in the tunnel and had no interest in minimizing what had happened because he'd been there and he knew what it was. Pete told his wife Ruth, and Ruth told 3 people, and those 3 people told the rest of Dust Creek with the efficiency of a place where news is one of the few freely available commodities. The reactions divided roughly as Mara would have predicted if she'd been paying attention to the reactions, which she mostly wasn't. People who had come to understand her through the tax meetings and her visible competence at the Double V accepted the tunnel story as consistent with what they already knew. People who had not yet updated their understanding of her, who were still working from the image of the woman standing in the barn shadow at the Harvest Festival, the woman whose casserole dish Vivian Cross had moved without a word, found themselves with 2 incompatible pictures and the uncomfortable work of deciding which one was accurate. Vivian Cross was among the latter group, and she had been sitting with the discomfort for longer than most. She came to the Double Vi on a Tuesday in late February, which was not a social visit anyone had arranged. She simply appeared at the door in the middle of a workday morning. Mara saw her from the barn, crossing the yard in her good coat, and for a moment she felt the old reflex of the barn at the Harvest Festival, the instinct to find the edge of the room. She put it down and kept walking. "Mrs. Voss," Vivian said when Mara reached the door, and the use of the name was deliberate and careful, the way you handle something you know is breakable. "Vivian," Mara said, "come in." She brought her into the kitchen, where the fire was going and the morning's work was spread across the table. Supply lists, the tunnel improvement plans she'd been drafting, a letter to a timber supplier about bracing materials. She swept it to the side and put the kettle on without asking, because that was what you did. Vivian sat down and looked around the kitchen with the eyes of a woman taking inventory, not unkindly, just observationally. She was not a stupid person. Mara had understood that from the beginning, even at the barn. Vivian's problem was never intelligence. It was the catalog she'd built of what certain things meant, and how confident she'd been that the catalog was complete. "I want to say something," Vivian said when the tea was poured, "and I want you to hear it plainly, not as a social performance." Mara sat down across from her. "All right." "I misjudged you," Vivian said. She said it directly, without embellishment, which cost her something. Mara could see that it cost her, could see the slight compression around her eyes that was the effort of a proud woman saying a difficult thing without dressing it up. Not just at the festival, before that. I made an assessment of who you were based on information I decided was complete, and it wasn't. Mara looked at her for a moment. She thought about what it would feel like to say what Vivian was saying, the particular exposure of it, the absence of any defensible position. She understood why it was hard. I'm not angry at you, Mara said. I know, Vivian said. That's not why I'm here. I'm not here to be forgiven. I'm here because… She stopped, looked at her tea, started again. There are 3 farm families on the south side of town who are going to lose their properties before spring. The debt is real, and the people holding the notes are calling them. I've known about it for 6 weeks, and I've been trying to think of what can be done. And I keep arriving at the same problem, which is that I know the social architecture of this town, but I don't know the financial one. And you apparently do. She looked up. I thought maybe you would. There was a silence. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock, and a gust hit the east window with a sound like a flat hand against glass. Tell me the names, Mara said. Vivian told her. The Galens, who farmed 40 acres south of the creek. The Bauer family, older, second generation, who'd had a bad yield 2 years running. And the Crofts, who had 4 children and a mortgage that had been restructured twice. Mara listened without writing because she was building a different kind of picture. Not numbers yet, just the shape of the situation, the way you'd look at a piece of land before you walked it. Do you know who holds the notes? She said. 2 of them are held by the Territorial Bank, Vivian said. The Croft note is held privately, I believe by Alderman Graves. Something in the room shifted. Mara felt it without moving. Graves holds the Croft note, she said. Privately, yes. He does lending on the side. It's not a secret exactly. It's just not publicly discussed. Mara sat with this. She was thinking about the September tax meeting and the November meeting, and the bracket cutoffs that kept moving in ways that specifically burdened small farm operations. And she was doing what she always did, following the numbers wherever they led. And they were leading somewhere that had a shape she didn't like. How long has Graves been doing private lending to small farm operations? She said. Vivian looked at her steadily. As long as I can remember, she said. At least 10 years. And how many of those loans have come due in foreclosure? I don't know the number, Vivian said. But there have been several. The old Mercer property, the South Alderman parcel, that was the Hendersons originally, before they left. The Hendricks tunnels, Mara thought. The tunnels on the Double V's north property that the old deed records called the Hendricks tunnels, that Dutch had said were closed off 10 years ago, on land that had once been the Hendricks family's before something changed and the Double Phi had absorbed it. She filed this. She would come back to it. What are you asking me to do, specifically? She said. I don't know, Vivian said, and she said it with the particular honesty of a person who has run out of their own answers. I'm asking you to look at it, that's all. I've watched you look at things and see what other people miss. And these are families who are going to lose everything in 3 months if nothing changes. Mara thought about the Bauer family, second generation, who had put 2 years of bad yield into a piece of land their parents had broken their backs on. She thought about the Croft children, 4 of them. She thought about what she knew of debt and land and the particular desperation of a bad March, when you can see the spring coming but not fast enough. I'll need to see the loan documents, she said, whatever's public record, and I'll need to talk to the families directly. I can arrange that, Vivian said. I'm not promising anything, Mara said. I'm promising to look. That's more than I had yesterday, Vivian said. She stood to leave and she was pulling on her coat when she stopped and said, without turning fully around, At the festival, the dish. I want you to know that It's done, Mara said. Not unkindly, just finally. Leave it. Vivian turned enough to show her profile, and there was something in it that wasn't the managed composure of a woman who'd always known her place in the world. It was something more uncertain than that, more human. All right, she said, and left. Mara stood in the kitchen after the door closed and looked at the fire for a moment, not thinking, just letting the morning settle around her. Then she pulled her supply list back to center of the table and picked up her pencil, but she was not looking at the supply lists. She was thinking about a dead man's tunnels and a tax schedule with moving bracket cutoffs, and an alderman who did private lending to small farm operations and called the notes when they were most difficult to pay. She was thinking that some things that looked like separate problems were the same problem with different faces. So began with the public records. The county land office kept deed filings, transfer records, and probate documentation in bound volumes that went back 40 years. And the clerk, a thin, meticulous man named Aldous, who'd been in the position since before Mara was born, allowed her to sit in the back room with the volumes and her notebook for as many hours as she needed, because she'd once helped him understand a boundary dispute that had been confusing him for months, and he had the practical loyalty of a man who valued competent help. She spent 3 afternoons there over 2 weeks. What she found was not hidden. Nothing was hidden, it was all there in the records. But it was distributed across 20 years of filings in a way that made it visible only if you were looking at all of them together, rather than at any single document. The pattern, when she mapped it, looked like this. A small farming family took out a private loan, typically at a moment of vulnerability, a bad yield, a medical expense, a necessary equipment purchase. The lender, in most cases, was a private individual or a private lending entity. Several of those entities, she found, traced back through a chain of names and signatures to a single principal. The loans were structured with standard terms that looked reasonable until you noticed that the interest calculation method produced effective rates significantly higher than the stated rate, a technicality that would not be obvious to someone who wasn't reading the arithmetic carefully. When the notes came due, they came due at times that correlated, not perfectly, but consistently enough to notice, with other financial pressures that Mara could map to county-level decisions about road access, water rights, and grazing permits. She sat with this for a long time before she was willing to call it what it was. It was a mechanism, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. There was no secret room, no handshake agreement she could point to. It was a mechanism, a set of interlocking parts, each one defensible individually, that together produced a predictable outcome. Small farms went into debt. The debt was called at difficult moments. The land transferred, the holdings consolidated. She could see graves in it clearly. She could see the tax schedule proposals in a different light. They hadn't been primarily about revenue. They'd been about accelerating pressure on the small operators who were already carrying debt, squeezing from 2 directions at once. She wrote it out in full in her notebook, every chain of documentation, every date, every name, every number. It took 12 pages. Then she took it to Colton. He read it at the kitchen table with his repaired arm resting on the tabletop, in the slow, careful way. He read things that mattered. Going back twice over sections, she could see him checking against themselves. He was quiet for a long time after he finished. "How solid is this?" he said. "Every piece of it is public record," she said. "Every connection I've drawn has documentation. I haven't stated anything I can't source. Graves will contest the interpretation." "He can try," she said. "The arithmetic doesn't change." He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression she'd learned meant he was running the consequences forward in time, playing out the sequence of events the way you'd work through a chess position. "If you take this to the county commissioner," he said, "Graves will know within a day." "Yes." "He'll start moving to protect himself. That could accelerate the Galen, Bauer, and Croft notes." "I know," she said, "which is why before I take it to the commissioner, I need to deal with those 3 notes." He looked at her. "The Territorial Bank holds 2 of them," she said. "The bank manager is Nathan Poole, Hester Poole's husband." "I know Nathan," Colton said. "I know," she said. "I need you to go with me to Nathan, not to pressure him, to ask him if he'd be willing to restructure the Galen and Bauer loans on terms the families can actually meet before this becomes public and creates a situation the bank doesn't want to be associated with." Colton was quiet for a moment. "And the Croft note? Graves's note?" "That's different," she said. "A privately held note isn't subject to the same restructuring conversation. But there are legal grounds to challenge the interest calculation method as structurally deceptive, and if I can get an attorney to look at it before it's called—" "Tom Bledsoe," Colton said. "He's in Ridgeline, 30 miles east. He handled a contract dispute for me 2 years ago. He's good, and he's not connected to anyone in Dust Creek. Can you get him here this week?" "I can write today," he said. She nodded. He looked at her across the table, at the 12 pages of documentation, at her notebook open beside it with the maps and chains and dates. "You've been working on this for 2 weeks," he said. 14 days, she said, "since Vivian came." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure what I was looking at," she said. "I didn't want to put your name on something I couldn't fully support." He was quiet with that, She knew him well enough by now to know that the quietness was not distance. It was the opposite. It was the thing he did when something had reached him and he was deciding how to hold it. "Mara," he said. "Don't," she said. "We have work to do." "After the work," he said. "After the work," she agreed, and that was enough. Uptown. Nathan Poole was a cautious man who had built a reputation on being careful, and careful men in Nathan's position feared association with disreputable processes more than they feared almost anything else. When Mara and Colton sat across from him in his office at the Territorial Bank, and Mara walked him through the mechanism, not accusatorially, just factually, the way she'd explained the waterline seepage to Colton on that first frozen morning, she watched his face move through several phases. Skepticism first, then attention, then the careful stillness of a man who is calculating risk. "Even if your analysis of the broader pattern is accurate," Nathan said, "the Galen and Bauer loans are legitimate instruments." "They are," Mara said. "I'm not asking you to invalidate them. I'm asking you to consider restructuring them on terms that keep the families on their land and the bank in a better position than it would be in a public accounting of how small farm loans in this county have been managed over the last 20 years. She'd chosen the last sentence carefully, not a threat, just a direction she was pointing. Nathan looked at Colton. "Is she always like this?" he said. "Pretty much," Colton said. Nathan looked back at Mara. He had the expression of a man who has encountered something that was not in his original plan for the day and is adapting to it. "What terms are you proposing?" he said. She had those in her notebook, too. She opened to the page. It took 2 hours, and Nathan did not agree to everything, and the terms they landed on were not everything she'd wanted, but they were enough. A 5-year extension on the Galen note at a fixed rate, and a revised payment schedule for the Bowers that aligned with their harvest cycle rather than running against it. Both families would keep their land. Both notes would be off the table before anyone started asking public questions about the broader pattern. Tom Bledsoe arrived from Ridgeline on Thursday. He was a compact, precise man who read documents with the same focused attention Mara used on financial records, and he took the Croft note documentation and her analysis and sat with it for an evening, and came back to the kitchen table the following morning and said, "The interest calculation is defective under territorial statute. It's not ambiguous. If this goes before a circuit judge, the Crofts win." "Will it go before a judge?" Colton said. "Not if the note holder is rational," Bledsoe said. "If the note holder is rational, he settles." "And if he's not rational?" Mara said. Bledsoe looked at her with the slight smile of a man who dealt in legal certainties and found the question professionally satisfying. "Then he's irrational in front of a circuit judge holding a defective instrument, which is a very uncomfortable place to be irrational." She went to see the Crofts that afternoon, driving the buckboard out to their property south of town. It was a Thursday in March, and the thaw was coming unevenly, mud and ice alternating in a way that made the road difficult. And by the time she arrived, her boots were a mess, and she had to wait while Ada Croft, who answered the door with a 4-year-old on her hip, and the expression of a woman who had been managing dread for 6 weeks, recognized that the visitor was not a creditor. She sat in Ada Croft's kitchen and drank coffee that tasted like the family had been stretching the grounds for a week, and she explained what she'd found and what Tom Bledsoe had said and what the likely outcome was. And Ada Croft listened with the careful stillness of someone who is afraid to believe good news until they're sure they've heard it correctly. "He can't call the note?" Ada said. "He can call it," Mara said. "He will lose in court if he does." "Court costs money," Ada said. "Bledsoe is willing to take the challenge on deferred payment," Mara said, "payable when the note is discharged." Ada was quiet for a moment. The 4-year-old on her hip reached for Mara's coffee cup with the confident entitlement of very small children, and Ada redirected the hand without looking down, the automatic movement of a person who has been doing this so long it no longer requires thought. "Why are you doing this?" Ada said. It was not an accusatory question. It was genuine. Mara thought about how to answer. She thought about the tax meeting and the numbers on the chalkboard and the room full of people who'd almost let something happen to them twice. She thought about her father and the farm she'd held together by herself for years, and the particular exhaustion of fighting alone. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said, "and I can see how to do it." And Ada Croft looked at her with the expression of a woman who understood that some answers were that simple, and that the simplicity didn't make them small. The documentation went to the county commissioner in the second week of March. She'd written it up formally, with Bledsoe's guidance on structure and Tom's signature alongside hers as a legal attestation of the public record sourcing. It was 41 pages. It named Alderman Graves specifically, and it named the mechanism specifically, and it did not soften either, because she had learned that softening was how these things survived to cause harm again. Graves knew within a day, as Colton had predicted. His response was first to contact his attorney, who sent a letter to Tom Bledsoe calling the documentation defamatory, and then to attempt to appear at the commissioner's office to characterize the filing as a personal vendetta by a newcomer to the county with incomplete knowledge of local financial history. The commissioner, a woman named Arden Fitch, who had been in the position for 9 years and had no interest in being used as a backdrop for someone else's damage control, declined to receive Graves's characterization and forwarded the documentation to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review. Word of this traveled through Dust Creek in 48 hours. The reactions this time were less divided. People who had been on the fence about Mara, who'd been waiting for some sign that the tunnel story and the tax meeting victories were flukes rather than character, now had 41 pages of sourced documentation to consider, and the consideration shifted them. People who had lost land, the families who'd been on the other end of the mechanism over the years, who'd left Dust Creek or reduced themselves to tenant arrangements on land they'd once owned, had their losses given a name. There was anger in that, real anger, the kind that comes from understanding that what you'd experienced as your own failure was partly constructed, was a machine someone else had built to produce that outcome, and that you'd blamed yourself for walking into it. Pete Dillard came to the Double Phi on a Saturday and sat in the kitchen and said, "The Hendricks. They were part of this." "I believe so," Mara said. "I couldn't document it completely, but the pattern was consistent." Pete nodded slowly. He'd been in Dust Creek for 40 years, and he'd watched the Hendricks family lose their property and leave, and he'd filed it, the way you filed things in a place where you lived, as a fact of life, a thing that had happened. The tunnels on the Double V's north property. The Hendricks tunnels. An old man's name on a piece of underground infrastructure, the last artifact of something taken from him. "Damn," Pete said, very quietly. "Yes," Mara said. She thought about what it meant to document wrong things that had already finished happening. It didn't undo them. It didn't give Pete Dillard back 20 years of accepting the Hendricks family's departure as a natural fact. But it named the mechanism, and naming a mechanism meant it was harder to run it again in the same place on the same people, and that was worth something. It was not enough, but it was worth something. Well, Vivian Cross came a second time, in late March, and this time she didn't knock. She came into the yard and found Mara mending a section of paddock fence. Working weather now, the mud beginning to firm, and the light running longer. And she stood a reasonable distance away and said, "The 3 families know it was you." "They know there were several people involved," Mara said, without stopping work. "They know," Vivian said again, with the specificity of someone who has had the conversations and is reporting results. "Ada Croft told everyone. She's not a subtle woman." Mara set down her hammer for a moment and looked at Vivian. The afternoon light was going orange at the edges, the first real warmth of it they'd had, and it did something to the quality of the air that felt like release. "Is there something you needed?" Mara said. Not unfriendly, just direct. "No," Vivian said. "I just wanted you to know." She paused. "I've been thinking about the festival, about the dish." "Vivian, I know you said to leave it," Vivian said. "I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm asking if there's something I can do that's useful, not to make myself feel better, something actually useful." Mara looked at her for a moment. She thought about all the things Vivian Cross knew about Dust Creek's social architecture that she herself would never know as a person still learning the place. She thought about how knowledge was only as good as the hands it was in. "Can you bake?" Mara said. Vivian blinked. "Can I? Yes, of course I can bake." "The Bowers are going to need help getting through to the first harvest under the new loan terms," Mara said. "They're short on labor and the wife is expecting. There's a group of women who've been organizing supply contributions. Ruth Dillard is coordinating. They could use someone who knows how to run a coordination effort." Vivian looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd had in the kitchen on her first visit, uncertain, stripped of the managed composure, more honest than she usually allowed herself to be. "That's it?" she said. "What were you expecting?" Mara said. Something harder, Vivian said. It's not easy to organize 7 women toward a common purpose, Mara said. Ask Ruth. Vivian almost smiled. It was not a full smile, but it was a start, and starts were what you worked with. She went. Mara picked up her hammer and went back to the fence, and the orange light moved across the yard, and the horses stood easy in the paddock, and somewhere in the house she could hear her father's slow steps moving to his window, where he liked to watch the late afternoon. She kept working until the light failed completely, and then she came inside and washed her hands at the kitchen basin and looked at the water going brown with the work of the day. And she thought about the Hendricks tunnels and the Croft children and Ada's coffee grounds stretched thin and a machine someone had built to take things from people and run it under their noses for 20 years. She thought about what it meant to see something clearly. It meant you were responsible for what you saw. There was no putting it back down once you'd picked it up. Once you could see the mechanism, you were the person who could see it, and that came with a weight she hadn't chosen and wasn't going to put down. Colton came in from the evening check and found her standing at the basin with the water run out and her hands still wet and her eyes somewhere else entirely. Come eat, he said. In a minute, she said. He put a hand on her shoulder, just there, just the weight of it, and left it for a moment, and she felt herself come back into the room, into the kitchen with its fire and the smell of Bess's salt pork from that morning still in the walls, and her father's steps overhead. In a minute, she said again, but it was different this time. She dried her hands and followed him to the table, and her father was already there, moving carefully with his evening cup, and outside the first stars were coming up over the ridge the way they always did, indifferent and permanent and very beautiful, and the 3 of them sat down together in the warmth of the kitchen in the last of winter and ate. Spring came to Dust Creek the way it always came, reluctantly, in pieces, with false starts and cold reversals that made you doubt it was coming at all before it finally arrived in full and made you forget you'd ever doubted. The mud firmed, the light ran longer, the horses in the paddock stood in the afternoon warmth with the particular stillness of animals that have survived a hard winter and are taking a moment to acknowledge the fact. Walter Whitlock noticed the spring from his chair by the east window. He'd been noticing things from that chair since February, when the bad week had settled into a new baseline that was lower than before, but stable enough that Hartley stopped coming out every week and started coming every 2. The chair had become the center of his world in the way that chairs become centers of worlds for people whose radius has contracted, not with bitterness, at least not mostly, but with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned to find the available world sufficient. He watched the pasture change. He watched the light move. He watched Mara cross the yard in the mornings with her notebook under her arm, and he watched Colton fall into step beside her sometimes without it being arranged, the way people who have learned each other's rhythms move together without negotiation. He watched this, and he was grateful for it in a way he couldn't have articulated without embarrassing himself, and possibly her, so he didn't articulate it. He just watched. On a morning in the first week of April, he called Mara into the room and asked her to sit down, which she did, reading his face the way she'd always read his face, the instrument she'd learned before any other. I want to talk about the South Pasture, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The South Pasture, her family's South Pasture, the one she'd been calculating the sale of for 6 months before she'd married Colton, the last plan her father had held on to. They'd kept it. When she moved to the Double V, she'd kept the Whitlock property nominally, the farmhouse rented to a young couple from the next county who were trying to establish themselves, the South Pasture sitting idle under the rental arrangement. What about it? She said. I want you to sell it, her father said. Walter. The young Olson family has been asking about it, he said. They want to expand their grazing. It's a fair price and they're good people, and I want you to sell it while I can still tell you to. She looked at him. She knew what he was saying under what he was saying, which was that he wanted to close this account while he still had the clarity to participate in the closing. He was a man who had spent his life not finishing things, not through lack of caring, but through lack of luck and health, and he was trying to finish this one on his own terms. All right, she said. The money goes to you, he said, not to the ranch, to you, your own account. Walter, Mara. His voice was patient and final, the voice of a man who has already had the argument with himself and arrived at his position before calling the meeting. You are a married woman on a prosperous ranch, and that is a good thing. It is also not the same thing as having your own money. Your mother had nothing of her own, And when I got sick, she had nothing, and that is not something I did well by her. You will have something of your own." She sat with that for a long time. The morning light came through the east window and lay across the floor between them, warm and specific. "I'll contact the Olsons this week," she said. He nodded and closed his eyes, satisfied, and she sat with him a while longer in the quiet, not needing to fill it. The Territorial Attorney General's review of the documentation Mara had filed took 11 weeks, which was faster than Tom Bledsoe had expected, and slower than Mara had hoped. What came back in mid-April was a formal finding that the lending practices documented in the filing constituted a pattern of structured financial deception under territorial statute, and that Alderman Graves faced civil liability to the affected parties and was referred for criminal review on 3 specific counts related to the deliberate structuring of loan instruments to obscure effective interest rates. Graves resigned from the town council on a Tuesday by written letter, which arrived at the Grange Hall the same morning the finding was published. The letter said he was stepping down for personal reasons. It was 4 sentences long and did not address anything. Mara heard about it from Pete Dillard, who stopped by the Double V on his way back from town with the expression of a man who has been carrying news he can't wait to deliver. She was in the equipment shed when he arrived, working on the inventory she'd been doing since March, and she came out with her hands dirty and listened to what he said and was quiet for a moment. "How's the town taking it?" she said. "Mixed," Pete said. "People who lost land are angry it took this long. People who didn't are trying to figure out what they knew and when they knew it." He paused. "Most people are landing somewhere in the middle, which is where most people land." "Yes," she said. "There's talk about a community meeting," he said, "about what to do with the public record now that it exists, whether there's any remedy for the families who lost property years back." "There probably isn't much," she said. "Not legally. Some of those transfers are 20 years old, but the record should be there. People should know what happened." "There's talk," Pete said, with the deliberateness of a man preparing to say the actual thing he came to say, "about who should run the meeting, and your name has come up." She looked at him. "My name," she said. "You'd be good at it," he said. "You've run 2 town meetings effectively already, even when you weren't officially running them." "I was asking questions," she said. "That's not running a meeting." "It looked the same from the back row," Pete said, with the mild accuracy of a man who had been watching from the back row and knew what he'd seen. She didn't answer right away. She was thinking about what it meant to stand at the front of a room in Dust Creek. This town that had known her as the woman in the barn shadow, the woman whose casserole dish got moved without a word, the woman who had spent 27 years being looked past. She was thinking about whether she wanted that, and the answer was not simple, because she was not simple. She did not want to be a symbol. She was tired of being a symbol before she'd even had the chance to become one. She'd been the symbol of what a woman shouldn't aspire to, and now there were people who wanted to make her the symbol of what a woman could be, and both versions required her to stand still and mean something to other people, and she had never been good at standing still. What she wanted was to do the work. That was all she'd ever wanted. To look at the thing that was wrong and figure out how to make it less wrong and do the work that the figuring required. The meeting was part of that work, or it wasn't. She thought about the Croft family and the Bowers and the Galens. She thought about Ada Croft's 4-year-old reaching for her coffee cup with absolute confidence, and what it meant that those children would grow up on land that was theirs, that the machine had been interrupted before it reached them. "I'll run the meeting," she said, "but I want it structured correctly, not as a grievance session, as a planning session. What do we document? What do we protect going forward? What systems do we put in place so this is harder to run again?" Pete nodded. "That's exactly what it should be," he said. "Tell whoever's organizing it to come see me," she said, and went back into the equipment shed because the inventory wasn't going to finish itself. The meeting happened on a Thursday evening in late April, in the same Grange Hall where she had stood at the chalkboard in September and watched the room understand what the numbers meant. There were more people this time, close to 90, which was most of the adult population of Dust Creek and its near surrounds. People had come from neighboring properties, from small farms she'd never visited, from households she knew only by name. She stood at the front of the room, and she was not comfortable. She wanted to be honest about that, at least with herself. Her hands were not entirely steady when she set her notebook on the table, And she was aware of every person in the room in the way that you're aware of 90 people when you've spent most of your life being invisible to them, and now you're not. She didn't try to talk herself out of the discomfort. She just stood in it and began. She opened with the documentation, not all of it, but the shape of it, the mechanism made plain in plain language. She named what had happened without drama, because drama would have made it about the telling rather than the thing being told. She showed the pattern of transfers. She showed the loan structures. She showed the dates and the amounts and the names. The room was very quiet. Then she put the past aside and moved to the future, because that was what she'd told Pete the meeting was for. She proposed three things: a community documentation effort to complete the historical record of property transfers in the county, going back 30 years, done by volunteers and deposited with the county land office. A lending transparency agreement that the territorial bank and any private lenders operating in the county would be asked to sign, making effective interest rates plain in standard language. And a standing committee of community members who would review any proposed tax or fee schedule changes before they went to formal vote, with the specific mandate of assessing their effect on small versus large operations. The third proposal required naming people to the committee. She did not put herself on it, deliberately, because she understood that the value of what she'd done was in setting up something that didn't require her to be present to function. She named Pete Dillard and Nathan Poole from the bank, who had shown himself capable of responding to a reasonable argument, and a farmer from the South Creek area named Magnus Galler, who had been at the September meeting and had understood the arithmetic faster than anyone else in the room, and she named Vivian Cross, which caused a murmur. She waited for the murmur to settle. Vivian Cross knows how this town is organized, Mara said, when it had. She knows who talks to whom and what gets said in which rooms. That knowledge is useful on a committee whose job is to notice when something is being slipped past the community. The committee's job is not to be composed of people who are already trusted by everyone. It's to be composed of people who can actually see what needs to be seen. Another quiet. Then Pete Dillard said, from his usual back row position, "That's reasonable." And the room, which had been waiting for someone to say the first sensible thing, moved toward agreement. Vivian Cross, who was sitting in the third row, did not change her expression, but she was very still in the particular way of a person absorbing something unexpected. And when the meeting concluded and people were talking in the dispersing way of meeting attendees deciding whether to stay or go, she crossed to where Mara was gathering her papers from the table. "You could have left me off," Vivian said. "I know," Mara said. "Why didn't you?" Mara looked at her directly. "Because you're good at it," she said. "And because the committee needs someone who can walk into Alderman Graves's parlor, or whoever comes next, and be taken seriously before they've said anything. You can do that." "I can't. Not yet." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "Not yet," she repeated. "Give it a few years," Mara said, and there was something in it that was almost dry humor, and Vivian Cross, for the first time in Mara's experience of her, laughed. A short, real, surprised sound. The laugh of a woman who hadn't expected to be amused. "All right," Vivian said. "Oh, Walter Whitlock died in the second week of May. He did not die dramatically. He died the way he had lived in his best years, quietly, with more dignity than ceremony, on his own terms to the extent that dying allows anyone their terms." Mara was with him. She'd been with him every evening since the January decline, and the May evening was not obviously different from the others until the breathing changed in a way she recognized from having watched it for months. A deepening and slowing that was different from sleep, and she took his hand and stayed, and sometime in the early dark it stopped. She sat with him for a while after. She was not going to rush any part of this. Colton found her still there when he came to check, and he didn't say anything. He sat in the chair he'd moved to the corner of the room for the evenings when all three of them were in it together, and he was simply there, which was what she needed him to be. She thought about her mother, who had left too early and too fast for Mara to have been ready. She thought about the farm, the fence she'd learned to repair, the ledger she'd learned to keep, the knowledge that had accumulated in her from watching her father work and fail and try again and sometimes succeed. She thought about wild rosemary growing where it wasn't supposed to grow, and what you made with what was available to you, and whether that was loss or sufficiency. Both, she thought. It was both, and the both of it was what a life was. She thought about what her father had said in this room in January, "You are allowed to want things." And she thought about how long it had taken her to believe it, and how she wasn't all the way there yet, wasn't sure she'd ever be all the way there, but was closer than she'd been at the Harvest Festival in October with her boots damp and her arms aching and Vivian Cross moving her dish without a word. She was closer. She let go of her father's hand when it felt right to let go, and she stood up, and Colton stood too, and they left the room together. The funeral was small by design. Mara had known what Walter would want, and it was not spectacle. Pete and Ruth Dillard came. Dutch Haverford came, which surprised her and didn't. Billy Crane and Sal Morales came, and Bess came, and a handful of people from town who had known Walter in his capable years and wanted to acknowledge the end of them. It was a clear morning. The spring was full by then, the valley green in the way it only got for 6 weeks before the summer dried it back. And the light was the kind of light that made you aware of being alive in your body in a way that was almost uncomfortable, almost too much. She stood at the graveside in the small plot at the edge of the Double V's east pasture. Colton had offered it when she'd mentioned the difficulty of the town cemetery's distance, and she'd accepted without ceremony. And she felt the particular grief of losing someone you'd been expecting to lose for years. You thought the long expecting would prepare you. It didn't prepare you. It just meant that when it happened, you'd already been carrying part of the weight, and now you'd set down the waiting and picked up the loss, and the loss was different, more final, more specific. She didn't cry at the graveside, which was not because she wasn't grieving. She cried later, in the kitchen, sitting alone at the table after everyone had gone. And it was not graceful crying, it was the ugly practical kind that doesn't perform anything, that is just the body moving water through itself because it has to. She cried until she was done, and then she washed her face and put the kettle on and sat in the kitchen in the quiet. Colton came in an hour later from the evening check and saw her at the table and sat down across from her without asking if she wanted company, which was correct because she did and would have said she didn't. "Tell me something about him," Colton said. "Something I wouldn't know." She thought about it. "He could whistle anything," she said, "any song he'd ever heard. He'd be repairing a harness or splitting wood, and you'd hear it coming from 3 fields away. My mother used to say she always knew where he was by the sound of him." "What did he whistle?" "Whatever he'd last heard," she said. "He had no system. He'd whistle a church hymn and then go straight into something from a saloon and not notice the difference." She paused. "I haven't heard a man whistle like that since him." Colton was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he whistled 4 bars of something she didn't recognize, tuneful and ordinary, nothing elaborate. He stopped and looked at her. She stared at him. "You can whistle," she said. "I can whistle," he confirmed. Something in her chest broke open slightly, not in a painful way, just in the way things open when they've been held too tight for too long, and she felt it happen and didn't try to close it back. "That was terrible," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been told." "Who told you?" "Eleanor," he said. "Many times." She nodded. They sat with both their dead for a moment, present in the kitchen, and it was not morbid or heavy. It was the ordinary way of people who have lived long enough to carry loss alongside the living, who understand that the dead don't leave so much as become part of the furniture of your interior life. "I want to plant something at the grave," she said, "in the spring, something that comes back every year." "What did he like?" She thought about it. "He liked things that were useful," she said. "He wasn't much for ornamental." She paused. "Wild rosemary comes back every year." "Then plant that," Colton said. She nodded. They sat a while longer, and the kitchen was warm and the evening was settling outside. And eventually she got up and made 2 cups of tea because the kettle had been ready for an hour, and they drank them at the table, and it was enough. The Olson sale went through in June. The money went into an account in Mara's name at the Territorial Bank, and she noted the number in her notebook the way she noted everything, specifically without ceremony. And then she went back to work. The summer work on the Double V was different from the work she'd known on the Whitlock farm, not in kind, but in scale. More animals, more land, more people whose efforts had to be coordinated, more decisions with more variables. She made mistakes. She miscalculated a hay reserve in July, and they ran shorter than they should have through a dry stretch, and she owned it to Colton without qualification and reworked the formula and did not make that particular mistake again. She ordered a piece of equipment in August based on a supplier's assurance that turned out to be half accurate, and the equipment sat unusable for 3 weeks while the correct part was sourced, and that cost them labor and time, And she was furious with herself in the quiet interior way she was furious with herself when she moved too fast on insufficient information, which was a lesson she kept having to learn because she was constitutionally inclined toward moving fast. Colton didn't rub it in. He didn't have to. She was her own harshest critic, and he understood this and left her to it, which was the correct response, and also occasionally infuriating because she would have liked, once in a while, to have someone to be annoyed at other than herself. "You could tell me I should have checked more carefully," she said once, after the equipment situation had finally been resolved. "You know that," he said. "It would make me feel better to have someone else say it." "It really wouldn't," he said. He was right. It really wouldn't. Dutch Haverford, by the end of that first summer, had become something she would not have predicted in February when she was reading his fractional pauses and filing them. A genuine collaborator. Not warm exactly. Dutch was not a warm man. He was a man who expressed care through competence and attention, which was a language she understood well because it was her own. But he began bringing her problems before they became emergencies, which was the practical definition of trust between people who work land together, and she brought problems to him in return, and the exchange built something between them that didn't need a name. She asked him once, toward the end of August, what he'd thought when Colton brought her to the double phi. He was quiet for a long time. They were walking the south fence line, the same walk she'd been doing since February, familiar now in every variation of light. "I thought he'd lost his head," Dutch said finally, respectfully. "And now?" He considered it with the same weight he gave all questions that deserved weight. "Now I think he saw something the rest of us were too settled to look for." "What did he see?" "Someone who looks at what's actually there," Dutch said, "not what's supposed to be there. That's rarer than people think." She walked with that for a while. The south fence was solid. She'd checked every post personally twice since winter, and the gravel-based sections were holding exactly as she'd said they would. "You're not wrong," she said. "I know," Dutch said, with the complete absence of false modesty of a man who knows his own value and has no need to perform uncertainty about it. "Neither are you, usually." "Usually," she repeated. "The hay reserve," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." The standing committee held its first formal meeting in September, a year after Mara had stood at the September chalkboard and shown the room what the tax schedule numbers meant. The meeting was procedural, establishing the review process, setting the documentation standards, assigning responsibilities. Vivian Cross ran the organizational part of it with a precision that Mara had expected and that still impressed her, the way competence in a form you hadn't previously observed impresses you even when you'd been told it was there. Pete Dillard proposed naming the committee formally because Pete believed that named things had more permanence than unnamed things, and he was probably right. "What should we call it?" Magnus Gaylor said. Pete said, "The Whitlock Committee," before Mara could say anything. She looked at him. "Your father's name," Pete said. "He paid his taxes in this county for 30 years and never got a fair assessment. Seems right." She opened her mouth and closed it. She thought about Walter Whitlock, who had not finished most of the things he'd started, who had spent his life in the grip of circumstances that outran his best efforts, who had died in a warm room in a well-built house with his daughter nearby, and what remained of his plans completed or at least closed. She thought about his name on something permanent. "All right," she said, "the Whitlock Committee." Pete nodded with the satisfaction of a man who has placed something correctly. Nathan Poole wrote it at the top of the minutes. Vivian Cross, across the table, looked at Mara with an expression that had nothing managed about it. "He would have liked that," Vivian said. She hadn't known Walter Whitlock, not really. She said it anyway, and the saying of it was a kind of gift, the gift of someone trying to acknowledge what a thing meant to another person, which is harder than it looks and matters more than it seems. "He would have thought it was too much," Mara said. "He didn't like fuss." "Same thing," Vivian said. "What?" The Harvest Festival came around again in October, the same as it always had, the same Grange Hall with the same lanterns and the smell of dried hay and wood smoke, and the same collection of people who lived close enough to the edge of things to understand that gathering mattered. Mara arrived without a dish. She'd thought about bringing one and decided against it, not as a statement but as a practical matter. She'd been working through the afternoon and hadn't had time to prepare anything, and she was no longer the kind of person who showed up early and stood at the edges hoping not to be noticed and brought a dish because she didn't know what else to offer. She arrived with Colton, who arrived with her, which was different from either of them arriving alone. The room received them the way rooms receive people whose presence has become expected, not with fanfare, just with the ordinary acknowledgement of people who belong where they are. Ada Croft caught her eye from across the room and raised a hand, the greeting of someone who has specific reasons to be glad to see you. Pete and Ruth Dillard were already there, Pete in his position near the back with his customary expression of a man attending an event he considers worthwhile but will not commit to enjoying too visibly. Hester Poole, who had eaten 3 portions of Mara's potato casserole at the festival a year ago and had become, in the months since, one of the most enthusiastic consumers of any food Mara brought to a community occasion, appeared at her elbow within 5 minutes with a plate of something and said, "Try this. I made it with the herb from your garden." And Mara tasted it and said, "More salt." And Hester said, "I knew it. Nathan always says I undersalt," and went back to fix it. And that was a completely ordinary exchange. And it was, in its ordinariness, extraordinary to Mara in a way she didn't try to explain even to herself. She had a conversation with Magnus Galler about the committee's first review, which was a proposed road maintenance assessment that was straightforward and probably fine. And she had a conversation with the young man Cal, the 19-year-old from the neighboring outfit who had come through the blizzard tunnel pale and shaking, who had apparently decided in the months since that the double V was his preferred model of how a ranch should run, and who had a question about aquifer mapping, and she answered it and pointed him toward the book she'd used and told him the county land office had soil records going back 15 years that were useful if you knew how to read them. Dutch Haverford was at the festival, which was not something she'd expected. He stood near the door with a cup in his hand and the expression of a man fulfilling a social obligation by being present without committing to active participation. And when she passed him on her way to find Colton, he said, without preamble, "Fence looks good." "It does," she agreed. "Gravel's holding," he said. "I told you it would." "You did," he said, and drank from his cup. And that was apparently the full extent of what he'd wanted to say, and it was enough. She found Colton near the far wall, talking to a rancher from 2 counties over who'd heard about the committee documentation project and wanted to understand the structure. Colton was explaining it with the straightforward efficiency of a man who had understood something well enough to pass it on, and she stood nearby for a moment and listened and thought about how much he'd learned in a year about things that had not previously been in his purview, not because she'd demanded it, but because he was a person who found understanding useful and pursued it. He noticed her and made room for her in the conversation without making it a production, and she joined it, and the 3 of them talked about documentation standards and community oversight for 10 minutes. And it was a perfectly ordinary festival conversation, and she was exactly where she was. She thought about October of last year. She thought about the barn door and the cold field and her damp boot and the things she hadn't known how to name. She thought about the dish at the end of the serving line and the walk home in the dark with empty arms and the ledger numbers she'd been avoiding, and the lamp burning low. She had not fixed everything. She wanted to be honest about this, even here, even at a festival with a warm room around her and Ada Croft waving from across it, and her father's name on a committee that was doing work worth doing. She had not made the valley fair. She had not undone the 20 years of the mechanism or restored the land to the families who'd lost it before she'd understood what she was looking at. She had not cured her father's lungs or given herself back the years of carrying the farm alone. She had not become a different person. She was still constitutionally inclined to move too fast on insufficient information, still bad at accepting compliments, still more comfortable with numbers than with declarations, still prone to lying awake at 3 in the morning, running calculations that could wait until morning. What she had done was see clearly and act on what she saw, and keep acting on it even when it was slow and hard and required walking into collapsed tunnels and blizzards and sitting in county land offices for 3 afternoons reading 20-year-old deed filings. She had done the work. That was what she had done. She had also, and this was harder to hold than the work, allowed herself to be somewhere, not performing her worthiness of it, not managing the distance between herself and the people around her, keeping them just far enough away that their departure wouldn't cost her anything. She had let the people get close enough to matter, which meant they could hurt her, which was the actual price of not being alone. And she had paid it, and was paying it, and would keep paying it, because the alternative was the barn shadow, and the empty arms, and the lamp burning low over the numbers that were never quite good enough. She was not finished. She was not resolved. She was a person in the middle of a life, with all the incompleteness that implied. But she was here, and she was seen, and she knew who she was. That was not nothing. That was not nothing at all. Colton finished his conversation and turned to her and said, "You want to walk outside a minute? The room's getting warm." And she said yes, and they went out the barn door into the October night, and the cold came off the hills the way it had a year ago. And the field was dark beyond the light of the open door, and she stood in it and breathed it in, and it tasted like the year she'd had, difficult and clear, and full of things that had been worth doing. "Same spot," he said, looking at where she was standing. "Not the same," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the look that she knew now, that she had learned like you learn the weather, by watching what accumulated. "No," he said, "not the same." They stood together in the cold field for a while, and the light from the barn fell yellow and warm behind them, and inside the festival went on with the ordinary sounds of people gathered in a place they'd made together. Voices and laughter, and the scrape of chairs, and somewhere a child asking a question too loudly and getting shushed. Mara thought about her father's whistle carrying across 3 fields. She thought about wild rosemary growing where it wasn't supposed to grow. She thought about the things you made with what was available and what that produced. Not what you'd planned, not what you'd imagined, but something real and particular and yours. She looked at the dark field. She looked at the light from the door. She thought, this is where I am. This is what I've built. This is what it looks like when you stop waiting for permission to want things and start doing the work of getting them. It did not look like what she'd pictured in those years when she let herself picture anything. It looked better than that because it was actual, because it had texture and difficulty and the smell of a real October night, because it had Dutch Haverford saying fence looks good, and Hester Poole undersalting her herbs, and Pete Dillard naming a committee for a man who hadn't wanted fuss, and Ada Croft's 4-year-old reaching for someone else's coffee cup with the complete confidence of a child who has not yet learned that the world might say no. It looked like this, and this was enough. She turned back toward the barn door, toward the warm room and the noise of people she knew, and Colton walked beside her, and the field behind them was dark and quiet and permanent, and she did not look back at it. She went inside.